It's at any rate, it's a genuine pleasure to be here. In fact, it's actually quite exciting because I had been hearing and reading for a long time about these Twitter storms and cancel culture, and I felt I was definitely missing out on something. And so it's been a great opportunity, and it's been lovely so far, and I look forward to the other talks today. And so, as anticipated, we are talking about the reproducibility crisis, which is a widely held belief. You might have seen this survey from the journal Nature amongst its readers, so not a particularly scientific survey, but 90% of the readers believed that there was a significant, or at least a slight, crisis in science. In fact, I'm curious, by raise of hands, how many of you would agree with that 90% of Nature readers. Okay, I'm going to say about maybe 70%, so it's a more diverse audience than you would otherwise expect. And just so that we know more or less what we are talking about, there is a sort of a reasonably coherent set of beliefs around this idea that there is a crisis, which has to do fundamentally, as illustrated very well by the sort of the high votes given by Nature readers to various suggestions, that there's this idea that, largely because of pressures to publish, scientists are increasingly compelled to selectively report their data, or make a poor or even deceptive use of statistics, or even resort to scientific misconduct in order essentially to get ahead in the game. And this is what is making science less and less trustworthy and reproducible. And this is what I call the crisis narrative, because it is a sort of a coherent story that, as David mentioned, I myself sort of effectively at least started from when I started doing this kind of work. And it is indeed a belief that as meta-science as a research topic becomes hotter and hotter, is sort of quite naturally spreading in the literature. So this, I wouldn't say it's the total count, but it's rather a proxy of what I think the scientific literature is going to reflect. So what I tried to do here was simply to get a Web of Science records that had a phrase reminding, sort of a phrase corresponding to scientific crisis or reproducibility crisis or the like, and then check how many of these were effectively endorsing this kind of narrative. And you see the numbers are sort of were, at least at the time, growing very rapidly. And as anticipated, what I'm trying to convey with this talk is, to some extent, my present understanding that this is not quite the case, and it's an evidence-based understanding. And I'll, in fact, only really briefly overview my basic viewpoint on the matter, but rather what I wanted to do here to move a little bit along, the reasoning, is to offer two further examples of why I think the very narrative that inspires a little bit of this conference, in the sense, and many other similar initiatives, along the lines of ficting science, is a self-contradictory narrative, and how, in fact, I think evidence shows that there's more understanding to be developed. And that, of course, is the soapbox that allows me then to advertise what I think is the way to go to understand better these problems, which is K-theory, which is something that I propose, and I'll offer a couple of examples to try to illustrate how it can be used. And this will bring me then to elaborate, therefore, on the theme of the talk, which is about reproducibility reforms if someone sees the world the way I do. So I would have loved actually to review some of the evidence that I discussed in this article, because it touches upon, for example, some of the things I already heard yesterday mentioned. But there's no time, and I always overtalk any talk I plan, so I'd better just move on. So this is sort of a very rough summary of what the fundamental argument is in this article that you see had quite a sort of a reasonably large impact in terms of altmetrics. And I mention this not because I particularly care about these metrics, but because, interestingly, a lot of this attention on Twitter, etc., was negative, or if not openly insulting towards me, which again sort of made me think a lot about how people who are supposedly science advocates can't stand the idea that someone is saying that science isn't broken. There's something weird going on. And my argument was simply that, it's been 10 years now that, at least 10 years, maybe at least 15 and maybe more, that people have been doing this kind of research better and better. And all the evidence effectively, in my opinion, pointed in the opposite direction of what was the implicit prediction of the crisis narrative. And therefore, bottom line, I don't think that there is a crisis, at least in the sense that one would read it, I would read it, in claiming that there's widespread and growing problems with, again, with the matters that we said, across all fields. And I think this message is factually incorrect. It is a negative message that is going to put off a lot of people from science for, again, not the right reasons. I would endorse it if I believed it, and it's prone to be misused in ways that, no matter where on the political spectrum, can be undesirable anyway or unscientific. So rather, I think what seems to be fitting better the evidence is a narrative of there being new opportunities and new challenges, which I heard yesterday already from one of the speakers, in fact, mentioned a little bit. And I think that's sort of a fair way to go, and a perfectly fair way to understand why we would be all here sort of wanting to discuss reforms to science and possibly improving the research process. So this is where I start from, and now I want to give a couple of other examples that I didn't actually, for example, illustrate in that article. And if you're curious, it's a very short opinion piece, so I would warmly invite you to download it, read it, and then go to Twitter and sort of throw in a few more insults if you like. But moving on to the issues, we've been talking quite a few times already about p-hacking, right? And it's this idea that one can very easily fiddle with the statistics, and if we are all compelled to just pass this, completely arbitrary threshold of statistical significance of 0.05, well, then, it's not too difficult to do so. And there's a straightforward prediction that, of course, if people are pushing their results, as it were, to pass this threshold, then you would expect a bump to show right at that threshold, an overabundance, in other words, of papers just below the 0.05 mark compared to what you observe before. Whereas if there's no p-hacking, then the shape of the curve might vary depending on what you assume the world to look like underneath, but the curve should be smooth. So this is a very simple and straightforward prediction to test, and there are indeed a few studies, recent studies, that had looked and claimed to have found this bump, for example. Okay. But similarly, there are at least as many studies that, even though they might have claimed to have found other evidence for p-hacking or other issues, they didn't find the bump. Okay. Now, techniques have moved on. There was this rather impressive study in 2015 that used a method that is actually a little more sophisticated, not just looking at a bump, but the principle is the same, and they famously claimed to have found widespread evidence for p-hacking across all disciplines. Okay, so case made. Well, not quite. Next year, this other study comes out. This is actually arguably in some ways larger, as in that it analyzed over 150,000 test results, although it was only in psychology, although certainly psychology has a reputation for being the country of p-hacking. And so you would have expected the bump to show up, and it didn't. So what exactly is going on? It gets even better, because one of the authors of this article, or at least some of the authors of this article, as well as other authors, tried to reanalyze some of the old data and pointed out how the positive findings of bumps in previous studies were highly sensitive to methodological choices or irreproducible. So what exactly is going on here? If we were, and this is my point, it's not necessarily to disparage this whole literature, but if we were to apply the same kind of standards that we apply to other fields when we discuss matters of reproducibility, then we would have to conclude that studies on p-hacking are being p-hacked. And this, by the way, again, this is something, I was being overgenerous to this literature in that opinion piece, but there's a forthcoming book that I'm happy to plug, and probably Lee is going to do the same later on. So there's an edited book on gosh, I can't remember the title, but it's going to be Research Integrity in the Behavioral Sciences, right? Something like that. And in a book chapter, I was lucky enough to have given us space to expand on these ideas and tell this and other stories. Moving on, so this was something about p-hacking and arguably about the causes of the reproducibility crisis, right? But one can fairly say, okay, regardless of the causes, surely, we're talking about a reproducibility crisis because reproducibility is at crisis low levels, right? And fair enough, we heard this claimed already a few times before, and in fact, we also heard the kind of evidence that typically is invoked to support this claim. And this is a monumental study, and still, I suppose, to this date, one of the most impressively done studies, which is the one from the Center for Open Science, which took, as you almost certainly know, a sort of 100 studies from the psychological literature in 3 journals, and then had 100 independent laboratories try to replicate one of these. And they famously reported how their estimates of reproducibility, or the proportion of studies that were successfully replicated was below 40%. In fact, 36% is typically the number reported. So case closed, right? No, because in reality, in the study itself, but you never hear this side of the story, different criteria had to be used to measure reproducibility. And depending on the criterion, one could have concluded something in the order of 60% or more. What you hear is always the lowest possible figure that one could have come up with. And this is part of the point. Again, the point is not here to disparage that literature at all, but is to say how, in fact, this kind of study, as it always happens when one does really good science, is that it sparked a whole range of pretty fascinating, from my perspective at least, debates as to, first of all, how are we supposed to measure reproducibility? What exactly we are doing when we're measuring reproducibility? What are we supposed to be measuring? Or even what do we mean? Because there seemed to be some serious terminological confusion around some of these debates. And these are not quite settled yet. And again, this is the science or the meta-science unfolding. But there's clearly no consensus around these matters, and we'll get back to them. But there's something more. Because even tolerating all this kind of uncertainty and doubts about the data, there are plenty of other studies by now that have tried to measure reproducibility. And sometimes you hear one or two of them, very rarely, I dare to say, reported in, at least for their main result, that presumably was the point of the studies. And it's studies such as these. So you have the study in science, you have the Many Labs project, you have a study in experimental economics, reproducibility project in cancer biology. There was one trying to replicate studies in social sciences studies published in Nature and Science, and the recent one in experimental philosophy, which I didn't even know it exists, but apparently it's a thing. And I don't know how well you can read from the back the percentages, but none of these studies reported a range that even overlapped with 50%. So the reproducibility was always above 50% in all of these cases. I don't know how many of you heard this story, but these numbers are telling something that evidently needs to be interpreted. And the question is, given that everybody believes that there is a reproducibility crisis, why do they say so if this is the evidence? So what I considered is 3 possible reactions, 3 possible thoughts that might in fact be going on, springing in your own minds as you just saw the kind of slides I showed. And in fact, I wonder, if you feel like it, that you could raise your hands if I'm guessing what you've been thinking, because I'd be curious to see if any of you is going through these kind of processes. And I have 3 possible options. So the first reaction would be, whatever these studies say, I don't care. I know that there is a crisis. I know what's actually true out there. Is anybody reacting in this way? Raise your hand. I know, that's why I said feel free, we'll count the non-responses at the end. Absolutely, absolutely. And so we'll know which. But so this would be one reaction, okay? To say basically, I don't believe the evidence. Yeah. And fine, but to be sort of fair to this kind of position, I would start by saying, fair enough, that means you have very strong priors that tell you that there is a crisis. And so it's going to take a lot for you to change your mind. And that's perfectly good. But again, I would point out that if you're applying the kind of standards I often hear, and probably I do it myself, applying to other fields when one is being critical about them, then this is going to look a lot like unconscious or conscious bias. Okay? And there would be plenty of sort of arguments to be made that the bias is conscious because of conflicts of interest, or agendas that people have, or the kind of investments in terms of career, time, money that people have made in these kind of topics that would want them to sort of believe and make people believe that the problem is as serious as it can be. I don't know if that's the case, but one has to face up to the fact that meta-research is at risk of these kind of issues like any other field. And here, therefore, the main point comes back to this idea of this narrative of fixing science being, if anything, a little naive and arguably self-defeating, and I would argue based on empirical evidence, self-defeating, and that clearly it can't be as simple as the fact that everything is broken out there, but what a coincidence, we are the one who know how to do things right and will fix everything. That clearly is not working, and it's probably for good reasons that require reflection. So this is thought number one. Thought number two. Oh, really? I ever actually had read the studies themselves. I just heard that there is a crisis. Maybe I read the headlines and all that, and I go along with the flow. So how many people, to be fair, had not actually seen those percentages or knew about all those studies? And those are not all the studies, but they are amongst the most influential and better made for sure. So you see, quite a few. Okay, so fair enough. And again, I understand that because we cannot know everything. And even, I would argue, in the topics that we consider ourselves or are considered to be experts, we'll never know everything, of course. So that's absolutely fine. Although, again, if we were to apply some kind of rigorous parameters about what might be going on and seen from the outside, there is a question to be made as then who exactly are the experts that are allowed to speak? Or, with what authority can we say that someone else doesn't understand what they're talking about? And so once again, there is a problem here. And arguably, it's a problem that it's worsening. And we all know that. There is ever more information that we could be processing, and we have, at least it feels like we have less and less time to do so. So again, there's nothing new under the sun. If anything, there are new challenges that are facing all fields, including our own. And so some of the problems that might get us annoyed and inspire criticisms of other fields are the exact same problems we might be facing. And so we're simply more coherently, in my opinion, compelled to see what's happening as just facing new challenges that we somehow live and need to help each other address. Finally, third thought. Actually, I interpret these exact results as suggesting a crisis. How many sort of think this is the case? Okay, good. All right, quite a few. Interestingly, it's a sort of a minority, I would say, although, of course, there's a lot of non-response bias, so probably point number one is by far the most present. Fair enough, yeah. I'll expand, on the next talk I'll expand this slide to more options, if you give me more possibilities. But, so again, fair enough, and I would argue, and now on a merely scientific basis, the way I see these issues, that this is a mistake. I think if that's how you interpret the data, is because primarily you're simplistically projecting a certain very idealized understanding of what science is supposed to look like and be on sort of a wide diversity of research fields that don't really work that way ever. And case in point would be the fact that people who know those percentages and think that there is a crisis evidently are predicting that reproducibility should be 100% across all fields, across all studies, all the time, or something along those lines, right? 70%, if it looks bad to you, it means you're expecting at least 85, 90%. So that is a prediction that you're making. It's a scientific, it reflects a scientific understanding of the matter, which I, however, again, I'm going to argue why I think it's incorrect. And possibly the opposite, in a sense, is happening as well. Going back to the idea of strong priors, that you've had pretty damning experiences and pretty telling experiences about how bad things can be in certain areas of science, perhaps, or any other experiences that you have. But then, improperly, in my opinion, you are extrapolating back those experiences and those, perfectly correct understandings to the rest of science, as if there's a crisis everywhere. Maybe There's only a crisis in some places. And this, however, points to what I think is a genuine gap in meta-science as we understand it at the moment. I think what is missing is a paradigm that is truly meta-scientific. Statistics doesn't do the cut, and I think most people come into this field necessarily by having trained in a particular area of research, so they have a particular understanding of the world. We all share a certain approach to running certain methods, but these don't quite work well in an optic where you're trying really to make a general statement about science, and yet you need to take into account, or in fact even explain, the diversity of ways in which science is manifested, if you like. So this is where my theory and methodology that I'm proposing comes in. It's what I call K theory, where K stands for knowledge, and the whole idea really it's based around this reasonably simple function, which I call the K function, okay? Simplicity is in the eye of the beholder in this case. But so K is, of course, stands for knowledge. And you see this is a function about functions. In particular, you see there's this H function, which is simply Shannon's entropy, which is the expected value of the information contained in a random variable. Now, if you're not familiar with the whole information theory business, which is likely, and it is, in fact, in my opinion, unfortunate, because none of us really, most of us, don't get trained into information theory the way I think we should. There's actually a very simple and intuitive and rather accurate way to understand the scientific concept of information in terms of answers to questions, or questions I need to ask to guess the value of a random variable, or to guess the state of the world somehow. So the quantity of information expressed in bits, for example, is going to be the number, or the average number if it's a Shannon entropy. It's the average number of questions I would need to ask to guess the value of a random variable. And so what this function is basically saying is that knowledge is a system-specific property that is given fundamentally by three factors that need to be measured perhaps in different ways in different systems, but overall it's always the same process, which is there's information that we wish to have, there's information that we have to put in order to acquire that extra information. So there's an explanandum, if you like, and an explanans, the way philosophers would put it. And there's residual information, which is what we will remain ignorant about. And so the quantity of knowledge is given by these three factors. Okay, so moving on and skipping on to the substantive interpretations of this function. The only thing I think is worth mentioning here is that so this is the mathematical translation, if you like, of a philosophical concept of knowledge, but it is something that one can sort of convert in actual measures of effect size in a way that I would argue expand on what we often do in statistics. And so, for example, it can give us theoretical answers to meta-scientific questions, such as what is the value of a null or a negative result? You sort of work around a little bit with a K function, and you would conclude that there's an upper bound to how much knowledge a null result, a null or negative result can give us, which is that quantity there. You see, it's logarithm of this sort of cardinality of t over, say, minus 1, where this quantity is simply the number of assumptions, experimental conditions, alternative hypotheses, alternative explanations, effectively anything else in the system that is not controlled by the study or is not ruled out by our result. Okay, again, it's something that people like Popper, for example, spoke about in narrative qualitative terms, but we can give a number to it, and we can, for example, sort of get a sense of how, what difference it makes, for example, to have more or less of these untested assumptions, etc. So why is this important? Because it gives us a little bit more of an accurate approach to understanding, for example, ideas that, again, in the literature are floated around. For example, in terms of whether we should always be concerned about a file drawer problem as opposed to being concerned about the cluttered office, as some have called it, problem, which would be the problem of having tons and tons of meaningless published negative results that, in fact, impede us to find the actual useful negative or positive results. There's an informational problem that can come from having too much clutter. And so now we have sort of at least a parameter that in principle is measurable to give us a sense of how to navigate this diversity of possible sort of costs and benefits, which is likely to overlap with disciplines. So very likely, physics and chemistry is going to be on the left-hand side more than ecology or sociology. but also methodologies. So I think, in fact, it's no coincidence that a lot of this concern for negative results comes from clinical trials and clinical medicine in there, because that's exactly a field where these factors are controlled for, and negative results are definitely highly informative in a way that in a lot of observational research they arguably are not. And this is a lesson not just for publication bias, but I think in general for fixes, that there are going to be costs and benefits, and the trade-off to be struck that is not even general to science. It requires a contextualization in ways that can be handled scientifically, but are not easy to tell apart and identify. So very quickly, the other thing, it's about reproducibility, and this is an example of how empirically one can use these methods. So we mentioned all these studies before, and we mentioned that there is a lack of consensus, for example, of how we measure it. And part of the problem here is that we rely, for example, on these binary arbitrary criteria to define these percentages, okay? And people who do these kind of studies typically detest the p-value concept or the confidence interval concept, and yet this is what we base our estimates upon. And similarly, in fact, the whole logic of thinking of reproducibility in terms of failures and successes is unscientific, and it doesn't match the data, where instead, of course, it's more a matter of degree, really, and very prominent statisticians have made this point. And again, we might be sort of a little confused as what exactly we're supposed to expect in terms of reproducibility to observe. And so the way this approach tries to do something different is to think about the whole problem in terms of signal detections and system. And so that the crux of the matter is that what we call the original study is not the way a statistician would typically model it as a random draw from a population of estimates of some underlying true effect, but rather an improbable informational structure that we have access to. It's been encoded somehow because it detected a signal. And this happened, by definition, in a sense, at least with high probability, in conditions that were favorable to detecting that signal. Okay, for example, in populations where that particular phenomenon is actually, sort of, for whatever reason, stronger. And it's the discovery, let's say, it's made by people who, not coincidentally were, let's say, working in that area and had made prior observations, have a certain expertise, have a certain tacit expertise, so they might even not know what they're doing, that it's actually correct. And the replication study, by definition, therefore, is going to, at least almost inevitably, have some divergence in any possible aspect of the system compared to the original. Or in other words, there's going to be noise that creeps into the system and therefore degrades this signal. Okay? And so again, we can give a sort of a mathematical shape to this kind of reasoning in the form of this function, which fundamentally simply says that the k that we could measure in a reproducibility study relative to the original is going to be a sort of all else equal a negative, an exponentially negative declining function of how many sort of random divergences there are times some factor lambda, which is how serious these divergences are, what their impact is on the result. And so this, first of all, rephrases the matter in a way that is non-binary, right? So from a theoretical level, at least, we sort of get rid of this idea that we have to measure success versus failure, and we can simply measure how much, essentially, and try to understand why that how much. And we can measure it, for example, by simply deriving from that function this metric, this lambda metric, which expresses the average, in a sense, knowledge loss. And it's something that is sort of a non-arbitrary. As I said, it's on a universal scale that can in principle be measured from any type of study. It can be estimated with normal ordinal regression methods, and it's interpretable in substantive terms as the proportional loss or gain of k, of knowledge. And in fact, we can sort of reconvert it back to a proportion or to a percentage that then applied to measure results of some of those reproducibility studies, in particular those from that were done on behavioral science. And you see something that it would have been impossible to observe with the kind of results that sort of are given that I showed you before, because you see there's a clear pattern in these bars. So now here we have that science, the large science study that we mentioned before, but divided between cognitive psychology and social psychology, the two main subsets of their data. Then we have the study in experimental economics, one in social experiments in nature and science, and the other one in experimental philosophy. Okay, so the pattern that seems to be here appearing once more, and I've seen this come up over and over again in my research, is that social studies appear to be less reproducible. Now, I see some heads nodding because, of course, they would be. No, that's where all the bad stuff is happening, or at least it's happening mostly. But again, there's just a warning here. That's not necessarily the case. It could be part of the explanation. But, very wise scientists have pointed out how the very fact that you're dealing with a complex system creates challenges with regards to how you understand and measure reproducibility. You might have heard about the reproducibility paradox. There's surely not going to be time to explain it. But it's simply the idea that if you have organisms that are whose phenotype, or whatever they do and that you're measuring changes with environmental parameters that you can't control or you can't measure or you don't know about, then the effect is real and it's actually quite systematic, but two laboratories that happen to have different conditions are going to find their results to be completely incompatible. And in fact, the more they make the studies precise, the more incompatible the results appear to be. And so it's a paradox of that kind. Okay? And similarly, I think scientists are actually, in many cases, ahead of the game in this regard. So there was this study in Nature, Ecology and Evolution that did something very interesting. They tried to improve the between laboratories standard deviation fundamentally of results, in this case about the yield of growing leguminosae in different conditions. And they showed how by increasing the variability, the noise, in fact, in the genetic lines that were being used, in the environment where these plants were grown, etc., the between laboratory standard deviation would go down. So results become more reproducible if you do the exact opposite of what, in principle, all scientists are trained to do, which is to standardize all experimental conditions. But again, just to show how complex the whole picture is, you see those high bars that don't have the nice stars, and they show effectively a null result. This is the exact same experiment conducted, however, not in a growth chamber, but in a glass house. And so for whatever reason, that same effect does not occur in a different setting. So matters are very, very complex, but there's a new science to be developed about addressing them. So finally, I'll get to the point. I'm all for reproducibility reforms, if anything, because again, I think there are new challenges and we need to update the scientific system to any extent. And I certainly don't think things were ever perfect. And so if there are new ideas to make them better, they are of course welcome. At least we should be experimenting with them. But there are caveats. One, as I tried to illustrate, meta-science epitomizes exactly its own subject matter. Okay, all the problems that we discuss, to my light, at least by now, are visible in meta-science itself, which shows, again, that we are deluded if we think we're better than everybody else and that we can fix science from the outside. Okay, it's more complex than that. We do not understand, for example, reproducibility as much. Okay, and something that I think I notice we all tend to do really, but it's something I pointed out in the NAS report, is that we seem to conflate reproducible with true, and the true two are not actually the same. As I tried to show, it's more complex than that again. And as I tried to illustrate, any reform is going to have costs as well as benefits. And we're in the Independent Institute, so I think you're sympathetic to the argument that reforms need to be made with great caution because they have costs, and these costs are going to be different by field. So there's a lot of work to be done, if anything, to make sure we do more good than damage. And the final caveat, it's something that I find myself thinking more and more. I'm not a religious person, but I've been often reminding myself of this passage, certainly when I hear about these Twitter storms and these battles and these trials by Twitter, but also increasingly when I hear people talk about reproducibility along the lines that sometimes happen. Some of you might know what I'm referring to. And again, I think this is something that, religion, again, I'm not a religious person, but I appreciate how much wisdom we seem to be losing as we lose contact with our religious traditions, and I'll let you read it. You probably know it already, and I'll thank you for the attention. Thank you very much.
One of the examples you pointed to is experimental economics, and that opens a question for actually doing some testing on in meta-science, in that experimental economics is actually relatively new. That it was started by Vernon Smith. There's predecessors, of course, but it's started by Vernon Smith, and he was aware of some of the problems in closely related discipline. So this is where, which is not in your logical setup, but this is where sort of an awareness comes in. And so if you're aware of problems in other disciplines, you can help establish conventions which will encourage things like data sharing, code sharing, posting of all of your research protocols on the web and that sort of thing. And so when a discipline is aware of problems, their behavior is going to be modified. And so that might be a way of looking to see where the problems, however you wish to define them, are more serious or less serious and that sort of stuff. So there's a dynamic to how scientists behave when they are aware. And of course, the awareness, they may be misinformed, right? They may think there's problems, but in fact there are no problems, but they will still act on what they know. And so that might be something to, how do you test the meta-science stuff? But I think you gave a wonderful challenge. It's a good morning talk.
I think there were several elements in your question. If I understand, so on the one hand, you're saying there's an element of usefulness of being aware of certain problems and sort of drawing inspiration from a certain narrative. Would that sort of reflect what you're suggesting? Which I don't disagree with. Part of what I'm saying is that there is no need to have that kind of narrative. And mind you, again, if that narrative were true, as it could have been the case because it was tested, that's my point. A lot of the evidence that has been produced by meta-science, by myself, but also by plenty of very clever colleagues, was aimed at sort of, if not directly testing, certainly sort of assessing and verifying these kind of beliefs we have about how bad things are. And again, my reading is that they're not as bad, and so clearly there's something about our premises that is incorrect. And that said, denying those premises does not entail that then we shouldn't be doing anything that we are doing now, because no one said that the system was perfect to begin with. There are new challenges, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't see a problem in just being a sort of objective, or at least open to changing one's mind about whether the problems are the way they are. We describe them.
Now, philosophers traditionally define knowledge as true, justified belief. Yes. Do you think knowledge has something to do with truth?
I always personally found that definition quite unsatisfying, precisely because it mentions something that then sort of seems circular, no? At some level, that the truth is surely what we're supposed to know if we investigate well enough or something else. But that said, what I want to point out here, as is discussed in the paper, this would be one of the critiques that I would expect a philosopher, in fact, to make. This kind of approach actually would reflect that value. Essentially, the higher the K, the more positive the K, the more you're having knowledge that is true and justifiable in the way indicated by philosophers. And so in that sense, that would be consistent potentially with that viewpoint. But then whether the viewpoint in itself, in invoking truth, is correct or not, we probably agree that we disagree. So the point is that it reflects that data. But again, maybe we should take that discussion outside. It is discussed in the paper, however.
I don't quite understand when you're doing K and you're counting your pieces of information. Okay, so you count the number of assumptions and you count the number of hypotheses and you count these things and you're going through all these papers to do your calculation. How do you know that you will count the assumptions, say, the same as somebody else? Because there may be hidden assumptions.
In fact, that example was a theoretical result. I am working on developing a methodology to measure these various aspects. I'm not saying, for example, that I have a good system for now to measure that in principle. But certainly that's the point of having a methodology. And certainly I would want to see how well it's possible to do so, how consistent results are, what the K-value of K-theory is. Absolutely, that's all doable. And there's absolutely no irony about it. But in other regards, for example, in measuring reproducibility, for example, by now, more than I even sort of was able to see when I wrote the first mathematical ideas, I actually think it's pretty simple and possible. Yeah. So it's doable. It's not as simple as it sounds, because field by field, there are different ways to describe, what's going on. So that's deceptively simple, if you like.
I'd like to just make some comments about perception. I think, first, some background. I'm editor-in-chief of a technical journal. I chaired its publications committee. We have found it necessary now for a number of years to institute some type of software to detect plagiarism. And that's very significant. And in fact, we still get people plagiarizing, sending us submissions, even though they aware. So it's clear there are high incentives for this. I think the other thing just has to do a lot with the press. I think about the number of times where I've seen some spectacular news story out there about what can or cannot be done in technology, or especially something that can't be done. And I sit there saying, well, why is it that there are 50 million people out there who have working cell phones with my components in it working perfectly fine, yet irreproducibly somebody has said it can't be done. So I think that's a little bit of the background of perception.
I think you may have tricked us with your questions at the beginning in terms of the dichotomy. I mean, how scientific is it to ask, is there a crisis or is there not? I mean, it seems a false binary. My field is economics. In our field, going back to Ed Leamer and back to the 50s, we've been questioning reproducibility for a long, long time, and slowly, I think we've been getting better. I think that's the more true narrative that I'm personally aware of in the field of economics. It's a long-term persistent problem. It's endemic in the way we do science, and we learn to improve. Social psychology is a new area, and experimental economics, they're right at the beginning stages of needing vast improvement.
I agree. It wasn't me posing that question, it was nature. And in fact, I mentioned that it's not quite a scientific exercise, and it's been criticized for that.
So thinking in terms of students trying to grasp these discussions in retrospect, what would you incorporate into, say, a statistics textbook, maybe aimed at a 2-semester basic course in statistics, useful in any field, that with all the publicity of the irreproducibility panic, let's call it, there really should be something in a textbook, at least a paragraph or a section, that addresses all these issues in some concrete way. How would you do that?
So by now, I suspect that there is, maybe not in textbooks, but certainly in courses. And so when I, for example, teach statistics to the students, the way I try to do it is to sort of mention these issues and then phrase them in the way I'm saying now, that it's sort of, this is still science in the making, and the fundamental problems have been understood for a very long time. They're not new, the limitations of p-values, etc. But we're moving forward, and maybe we'll get rid of them and anything. Then what I mainly try to do is really just to make sure people see what's going on when we calculate these p-values. As we were mentioning, in fact, before the talk, in a random chat, I think part of the problem is that by now computers are so widely available that no one actually sees what's under the hood anymore, or even looks at their own data anymore. Whereas what I emphasize, for example, with my students is that, well, all these p-values, these measures, they're adding actually nothing to the data. They're just transformations of the data that are intended as sort of tools to give you a different point of view to make some kind of informed decision about your evidence. But they're not adding anything technically to the information, the only information that you have, which are your measurements and your sample. And so I'm not sure it's particularly a good way to go. And as a matter of fact, I know that today we'll hear from people who say, we should get rid of everything about probably statistics. I don't know. And so, I'm definitely not presumptuous enough to think that I would have a good answer for that. But there's a lot of good work to be done in that space. But obviously, if you're not in a situation where there is this full consensus on these matters, and my understanding is that there isn't among statisticians of what exactly is good or bad about p-values, then it becomes hard to add something to a textbook that everybody would agree on by definition. So there's a challenge there, and again, there are people more qualified than myself, in fact, speaking today, that could have more informed opinions about it, including yourself, by the way. So you should write that up.